Hello, welcome to the IND podcast. I'm your host, Dennis Dunicic. Remember to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Join our growing international community. Now into our main story today, which is going to be about the diplomacy of the government of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. We have been covering the situation in Ukraine and the Russo-Ukrainian War extensively. Pretty much everyone has. It is impossible to talk about international relations or any global affairs today without mentioning or focusing on Ukraine. Now, something that has been overlooked, not necessarily overlooked, but not directly spoken about, has been the massive and impressive diplomatic efforts and success of the government of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. We want to talk about this today because fundamentally, this may be the most efficient diplomatic effort undertaken by any nation that is in a war in contemporary or modern history. Now, basically what happens when a country is at war, when two sides are at war, whether one is invaded or they're the ones doing the invading, what is extremely important is to gain international support. This can make or break a war effort. The fact is, the entire global community, especially during large conflicts, gets involved, whether directly or indirectly. Now, we have seen that extensively throughout this conflict. We have seen sanctions imposed on Russia and massive weapons provided to the Ukrainian military and its people. Now, while the West and many other nations have wanted to avoid getting directly involved in this conflict out of fears of provoking a larger war with Russia that would spill over into the rest of the world, they have been involved, and most of them have been on Ukraine's side. Even those who are supporting Russia, for the vast majority, are doing it in a very neutral way, avoiding poking the bear, if you will. Now, the reason for this really is because of former actor turned President Zelenskyy's diplomacy, which has been extremely effective. Ukraine has taken a tactic of very clearly conveying, communicating, and portraying itself as the brave people defending their homeland against Russian aggression. Now, this is factual. This is actually what's happening. It is undeniable that this is a war of aggression on the side of Russia that is attacking Ukraine, and the people in Ukraine are just fighting for their homeland. But Ukraine, their government, has done an excellent job at conveying and communicating this fact. In addition to this, Ukraine has managed to secure and guarantee a significant amount of Western assistance. And this has made a major difference. Keep in mind that Russia's military advance in Ukraine continues to be stalled. We have been reporting on this invasion since day one, 3 weeks ago. And the reality is outside of maybe 2-3 days of the initial conflict, Russian advances have completely stalled. And not much has changed except the capturing of the city of Kherson, which, by the way, Ukraine is attacking again and could potentially take back. And the fact that Russia has just laid siege to the countless cities of Ukraine, fundamentally because its military ground forces are unable to move in. Now, this has been done because of the Ukrainian fighters who are assisted by normal civilians partaking in militias or paramilitary groups. Nonetheless, these people are armed heavily with Western munitions and Western arms. Now, there has been what someone can call a bit of a failure in the sense that Zelenskyy has failed to secure warplanes from the West, particularly the United States. Though this is more of a failure on the West's end. There is too much concern about potentially provoking a conflict with Russia. As such, warplanes have not been provided to Ukraine, and the initial request by Zelenskyy to establish a no-fly zone has also been shot down. Now, this is not necessarily a failure on Zelenskyy's end. He's been as convincing and as pressuring as he possibly can be. Now, the reality is that this is simply the West not wanting to cause a larger conflict with Russia. Now, looking at all the aid that Ukraine has been given, we also have to take into account the sanctions that have been put on Russia, which have been devastating. And this is something Zelenskyy has been pushing for and pushing for and pushing for and pushing for. The reason why is because Ukraine doesn't necessarily have to win this war. Ukraine just has to create a peace agreement with Russia that is favorable towards Ukraine. And the reality is now this is a war of attrition, with both sides betting to see who can hold out the longest. And it seems that even though Ukraine is the country that is under direct military siege, Russia is the country that is under economic siege, being completely cut off from the rest of the developed world, economically speaking. And this is due in large part because of Zelensky's incessant and persisting pushes for further sanctions. Zelenskyy recently addressed the United States Congress, where in his speech he asked for more arms and he asked for more sanctions against Russia, stating that Ukraine needs you now, that Ukraine needs the United States right now. This puts political pressure on the leaders of the United States to do something, and do something they have. While again, Biden has failed to give Zelenskyy his major demands or his major requests of establishing a no-fly zone in Ukraine or even providing warplanes to the country, he has, just today, after Zelensky's presentation to Congress, agreed to give $800 million in further aid on top of a recently passed $13.6 billion aid package to Ukraine. This $800 million earmark is going to be purely for military spending. And finally, not just the sanctions are what has battered Russia, but Ukraine has had two major diplomatic wins today and yesterday. Russia has been kicked out of the European Council, which is the largest human rights body on the entire continent. The last country to be kicked out or leave the European Council was Greece in 1969, when a military fascist autocratic government was established in the country. Now, 5 years later, when democracy came back to Greece, Greece re-entered the European Council. Since then, no other nation has left or been kicked out of the EC. That has now happened to Russia, which is a major diplomatic blow to the country. And even larger is the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, what is commonly referred to as the World Court, determining and stating that Russia's war of aggression on Ukraine is unlawful and that it needs to stop right now. The reality is that Russia is not going to pull out of Ukraine just because the ICJ is telling it to do so. But this is going to further isolate Russia. And this finally highlights the entire diplomatic goal and the diplomatic basis of what Zelensky's government has been doing throughout this entire crisis. Presenting Ukraine as a Western-oriented ally and an innocent party that has simply been invaded, though is very strongly and effectively defending itself against a monstrous aggressor that is Russia. And this diplomacy has succeeded in uplifting Ukraine's stance on the international scene, opening up doors for massive aid coming from foreign and Western countries and other countries all over the world, while also isolating Russia, taking what is the world's largest landmass country and turning it into one large hermit kingdom. Zelensky's diplomacy is going to continue this tactic until peace is agreed on during this war. And the final piece of this diplomatic strategy has been establishing some kind of peace deal with Russia that is favorable towards Ukraine. And Zelenskyy has actually shown willingness to meet some Russian demands. We talked about this more in depth on our video yesterday, and I would highly recommend you check it out. We're not going to go in that much detail today, but Zelenskyy has essentially publicly shown that he is willing to drop the idea of Ukraine joining the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, publicly recognizing that it probably wasn't going to happen anyways, because NATO does not allow nations that have unsettled territorial disputes going on its borders, inside its borders. Now, finally, other agreements are being more likely to be made now, with both sides, the Ukrainian side and the Russian side, that are partaking in these peace talks, showing major optimism. The massive kind of agreement that is being looked at right now is establishing Ukraine as a bit of a neutral state and having a non-aligned military. Keep in mind that yesterday, Russia's demands, one of the major ones, was the demilitarization of Ukraine. That has essentially been kind of pushed off the table at this point. Ukraine is no longer being asked to demilitarize by Russia, meaning that after these peace agreements are established with Russia, Ukraine will maintain its military. However, it will most likely be a neutral country, which is not a bad thing. With good diplomacy, being a non-aligned nation is actually more beneficial than picking sides, as history has shown us. Still, this does not mean that peace has been guaranteed in this conflict. There are major issues that are going to be very difficult for Russia and Ukraine to agree on. Primarily Crimea, which Russia annexed and seized in 2014, and the eastern Donbass region, which before Russia's invasion, the Federation recognized as an independent state that is not part of Ukraine's territory. Obviously, it goes without saying that Ukraine recognizes both of these pieces of land as part of its territory, and this is going to be a source of continued contention. Until that's agreed upon, there most likely will not be an effective peace deal or ceasefire. But there is a push to do so because the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine is growing worse and worse every single day. Now, the worst hit city has been Mariupol, though thankfully 30,000 people have been able to evacuate the city in a large humanitarian convoy that we have been reporting on. Now, this humanitarian crisis, while completely dark and absolutely terrible, has actually, in a way, provided Zelenskyy with more diplomatic ammunition to continue isolating Russia, to continue putting pressure on Russia, and to continue getting concessions from Russia in what is essentially and probably going to be an eventual peace deal that may be agreed, in my opinion, by the end of this month that is favorable towards Ukraine. Again, maybe I'm being too much of an optimist, but let me know what you think in the comments. Let me know what you think about Ukraine's diplomacy in this entire crisis. Let me know what you think about Russia's diplomacy, which has essentially been a complete failure in addition to their military invasion. If you disagree with me, that's completely fine. Let's have a nice conversation in the comments. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you guys tomorrow.